roller kit for the motherbucker includes everything you will need to easily replace all the major wear parts within your machine. Whenever you're working on your machine, always unplug it first. Thoroughly clean your machine before you start the installation process of the new parts. Remove the hood. Using a 2.5 millimeter Allen wrench, remove the 2 screws associated with the coupler element ring. Slide the black cover to the side. Find the split in the green coupler element and remove it. Using a 5/16 Allen wrench, make sure that the pressure is backed off of both of the roller tension bolts. The next step is to remove the 2 force caps. Make certain not to adjust the nuts while removing the force caps. Using a 5/16 hex wrench, remove the 2 bolts associated with each force cap. Thread the bolts back into the holes and place the washer back on the bolt to ensure that you don't lose any parts. Using a T30 Torx wrench, remove the 2 bearing collars associated with the follow roller. Using a little bit of food grade grease, lubricate the side plates where the take-up bearings will slide out of the frame. From time to time, the follow roller can be stubborn to remove. To apply extra pressure, you can stand on the frame while pulling up on the follow roller. If you still can't remove the follow roller, consult the tips and tricks section at the end of this video. Using a T30 Torx wrench, remove the bearing collar on the opposite side of the machine from the motor. Using a 3/8 inch hex, remove the 4 bolts associated with the lower flange bearings and set them aside for reinstallation later. In order to remove the drive roller from the machine, you must first remove the die plate. Using a 3/32 hex wrench, remove the 4 bolts associated with the die plate and remove the die plate. Remove entirely the bearing that sits on the opposite side of the motor. Remove the drive roller from the machine. Keep your coupler element ring. You will need it for the installation of the new parts. The roller kit arrives with the bearings slid onto the shafts and the coupler hub Loctited and torqued onto the shaft. The drive roller for the motherbucker arrives with the bearing on the coupler side affixed to the shaft in a very specific location for easy installation. The distance between the inside of the bearing and the outside of the roller is 1 5/8 inches. Bearing collar on the opposite side will need to be loosened and the bearing slid to the end of the shaft for installation. Note that the bearing can articulate within the bearing housing. Using a dead blow hammer, you can tap on the bearing to make sure that it's aligned properly. Remove the old screws from the coupler element ring. Lightly thread the new screws into the old coupler element ring and hang the coupler element ring on the drive roller shaft before you start the installation. Carefully place the drive roller into the machine. Before bolting the lower roller into place, double check that your coupler element ring is hanging on the shaft. Rotate the bearing so that the greaser is located on top. Thread by hand the first bolt into the hole. You will need to lift the roller just slightly in order to insert and thread in the second bolt. Fully tighten the 2 bolts associated with this bearing and crank them tight. Before placing the bolts in this bearing, ensure that the greaser is pointed towards the back of the machine. Make sure that you hand thread each bolt into the frame to avoid cross-threading. Fully thread in the bolts and crank them tight. Now we will be installing the follow roller. Using a T30 Torx wrench, remove bolt bearing collars before you start the installation process. Using food grade grease, lubricate all 4 take-up bushings. Apply food grade grease to the side plates where the take-up bearings slide into the frame. It's very important that the bearings are square to the shaft before you attempt to insert the follow roller into the frame. Make sure that the grease zerks are on the bottom and the holes are on top. Slide the bearings on the shaft until it aligns with the frame and insert the follow roller into the frame. Remove the excess grease from the side plates. Align the follow roller with the drive roller and make sure the sides are flush. When adjusting the position of the follow roller, avoid using a hammer on the end of the shaft, which can damage the machine. Align the 3 remaining bearing collars so that the bolt heads face in the same direction. Apply a dab of Loctite to each thread. Give the bearing collars a tap to have the Loctite more fully engage the threads. Place the 3 bearing collars onto the bearings with the bolt on top and the bolt head facing the back of the machine. This will ensure easy access as you tighten down the bolt. We're going to be using a T30 Torx wrench to tighten down the bearing collars. It's very important that you apply significant pressure to the bearing collar while you're tightening down the bolt to make sure that it stays flush to the bearing. To check that the bearing collars are seated properly, give the rollers a quick spin and look for any misaligned bearing collars. Discovered a misaligned bearing collar in our quick test. We'll loosen the bolt, reseat the bearing collar, and snug the bolt back down. Another quick spin of the rollers shows that all bearing collars are seated properly. Torque each bearing collar to 160 inch-pounds. There's no need to torque the bearing collar on the coupler side. It's already been torqued properly from the factory. Now it's time to install the force caps onto the machine. You need to make sure that the holes used for the thumb screws are facing towards the front of the machine. The threaded portion on each one of the force caps is towards the inside of the machine. Also, make certain that the washers are placed on each one of the bolts before placing the force caps. Thread each one of the 4 force cap bolts into position by hand, ensuring that you don't cross thread the bolt. Using a 5/16 hex wrench, crank down each one of the bolts tight. Now it's time to check for proper roller pressure. This is a very critical part. Improperly adjusted rollers can affect harvest performance, and if too much pressure is applied between the rollers, it can damage your machine. This part is critical. Use a 5/16 hex wrench to tighten down the roller tension bolts that come through the force caps. To check the roller tension, we will be measuring from the top of the bottom shaft to the top of the top shaft. Given the critical nature of this measurement, it's important to measure accurately. A set of digital calipers is the right tool for the job. The proper measurement from top of shaft to top of shaft is 5.8 inches. If you don't have a set of digital calipers, a tape measure will do. The measurement from the top of the bottom shaft to the top of the top shaft will be 5 13/16. It's very important that the roller pressure is adjusted evenly on both sides of the roller. Now we're going to double check that the roller pressure is accurate on the motor side of the machine. Repeat the measurement for the motor side of the machine. Again, roller tension is absolutely critical, and damage to your machine can occur if this system is out of adjustment. If you need to adjust the roller tension on your machine, consult our roller tension video. Now it's time to install the coupler. The right amount of distance between the 2 coupler hubs is 2 millimeters. We've found that placing 2 credit cards face to face and inserting them between the coupler hubs is a good tool for this measurement. The distance between the two coupler hubs is a critical measurement. If this measurement is different than 2 millimeters, consult our coupler installation video. It's important to check that the coupler hubs are horizontally aligned. The coupler hubs should be no higher or lower than 2 millimeters relative to one another. The coupler element can wear out prematurely. If you're seeing misalignment, consult our coupler installation video on how to fix the problem. Now that spacing and alignment has been established between the coupler hubs, it's time to install the green flex element. Before installing the flex element, apply a liberal amount of food-grade grease. Before you can install the flex element, you need to align the coupler teeth. Rotate the rollers until the teeth are in alignment. Install the green flex element. Align the screw holes on the black ring with the green coupler element holes and slide the black ring into place. Use a 2.5 millimeter hex wrench to snug down the screws. Reinstall the die plate. Install the hood. Now that the hood and the die plate have been installed, it's time to do a quick check of the machine to make sure that the parts were installed properly. Turn the machine on and turn the speed dial up to 10. If you hear any knocking or clicking noises, it's most likely the coupler, and you should consult the coupler video to check for proper installation. Since you're living in the real world and you're not performing your roller swap in a perfect studio on a brand new machine, we highly suggest that you listen to the entire tips and tricks section to save yourself a whole lot of hassle. If you haven't maintained your machine properly, there's a decent chance that your shafts will be rusty and dinged up. Trying to remove a bearing from a rusty shaft is a guaranteed disaster. Your bearing will seize onto the shaft if you're not careful. The tolerances between the shaft and the bearing are very small. Any imperfections on the shaft will cause the bearing to seize up and lock onto the shaft while you're trying to slide it off if you're not careful. The important point here is, if the bearing's not sliding freely on the shaft while you're trying to remove it, stop and clean up the imperfections on the shaft before you continue. This will help you avoid seizing the bearing onto the shaft. If you simply sand the shaft down or file down imperfections, the job will be easy. The tools you will need to clean up your shafts include a Type A very fine Scotch-Brite pad, emery cloth, and a metal file. Make sure that you choose a metal file with a very fine pattern. The Scotch-Brite pad works well for light rust. The emery cloth works better for more stubborn rust. Your shaft should look brand new before you proceed with trying to remove the bearing from the shaft. Again, if the bearing hangs up at all, stop and continue dressing up the shaft before you try to remove the bearing. It's critical that you file down any dings in the shaft before you try to remove the bearing from the shaft. If the bearing ever hangs up on a ding and you try to proceed with removing the bearing from the shaft, it's a guaranteed way to make the bearing seize on there. If you simply push the bearing back onto the shaft and file the ding flat, the bearing will remove freely. Before you ever install a new bearing on an old shaft, you want to work very hard to make the shaft look as perfect as possible before sliding that new bearing on. Everything when it comes to sliding bearings onto shafts should happen very easily. If there's ever any challenges where you feel any resistance, you need to stop, dress up the shaft before you try to proceed. The initial move of getting a bearing onto a shaft can be a little bit tricky, but is easy as well if you're doing it right. Wiggle the bearing back and forth until you find the hole and slide on freely. Cut some strips of plywood of varying thicknesses from 1/4 inch to 3/4 inch. Round over the end of the piece of plywood to aid in inserting between the rollers. Use one hand to push the plywood in while turning the roller with the other hand to aid in feeding it between the rollers. This will force the rollers apart. You'll have to remove the first piece and insert a slightly thicker piece between the rollers. Wiggle the piece of plywood back and forth to continue separating the rollers. Force and wiggle.